Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Konstantinivka, where the Russians have managed to push towards the main road going through the center of the town. The Russians now control the southern bank of the river line in the eastern parts of Konstantinivka as they continue fighting in the direction of the central parts near the educational facilities to gain access to the crossing that moves through the northern and southern parts of Konstantinivka between the Dacia area and fortified position to the north towards the town itself in the south. The Russians have continued positional fighting within the town since they first got their foothold at the end of last month, and in this month they have slowly pushed through to the central parts. We see at the same time in the northern parts, the Russians have yet to gain a foothold in the Dacia area of fortified positions. They have not really been launching any offensive operations following the capture of Toretsk. Instead, we have seen some positional fighting last month south of Pobieda. This could indicate that the Russians are waiting for the crossing to be under their control before they launch offensive operations towards the northern parts, both the fortified positions from Pobieda and the Dacia area from Toretsk. So we see that positional fighting is likely to expand to the northern parts of the town once the Russians have gained control over the central parts of Konstantinivka. Further north, in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the northern parts of Garlivka, west of Yastrebodivka, where the front line is now exchanged by the crossing over the Karlovska reservoir. So we see that the Russians have positioned a foothold in the Dacia of Karolivka in the southern parts of the reservoir, and at the same time they've now pushed to the bridge here in the central parts, and in the northern parts the Russians have full control over the riverbank by the Vovcha River. So we see that the Russians now are fighting against the Ukrainians in two positions here to the east, both by the crossing of the Karolivka reservoir and within Karolivka itself. At the same time, with the recent Russian advances, they are now pressuring the Ukrainian positions by Komishivka and Petishche, where they're moving down in a southern direction towards the flank of Karolivka, where offensive operations will likely continue down south along the river line, where the Ukrainians are pushed up against a wall. In the direction of Selydove, the Russians have managed to gain control over some fortified positions just outside the Terikon Heights, as well as just outside Marinivka, where heavy fighting continues along the E50 highway, which is connected between Pokrovsk and down south towards Karolivka. We at the same time see that the Russians are now contesting the Terikon after a foothold gained within the industrial area of it. The sequence of events points towards the Russians gaining control of it, after which the Ukrainians launched a counterattack, and that is what is currently ongoing, where the Ukrainians are trying to reestablish control over it, and that is left in the gray zone, where neither side has control of it, but the Russians are attempting to gain full control of it, as the advantage gained by having it under their control would be a strong foothold to completely stop the E50 highway and any connection directly between Selydove and Karolivka, which would leave the Ukrainians in a position where they have to go a massive way around to reach Karolivka, and it would significantly strengthen the Russian positions to move further down south along the fortified areas, down to Ukrainsk, down at the bottom of the fortified positions going in a southern direction, and through Memrik, which would cut off the majority of supplies here in the southeastern parts, and be part of an operation of the Russians to completely cut off the Ukrainian positions to the east, all the way from Karolivka in the north to Ostrivsk in the south and Hustre. The Russians will likely launch an operation from Maximilianivka to gain full control of it, and then push in a northern direction to cut off the connection between Korohove and this line of towns, which are under Ukrainian control as a defensive line west of Krasnoyarivka. And the Russians will at the same time push down south along the fortified positions to gain control over the heights and fortified positions west of this village chain, all the way down south towards the Korohove and Vovcha River in the south, which would lead to the Russians completely cutting off the Ukrainian positions here in between the two sides. This will lead to an encirclement of a large portion of Ukrainian forces. Further north in the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to gain control over the Terikon here, the complete control over the second line of defense, and now they are moving towards the residential area and the forested areas within Toretsk itself, where operations will start moving in a northern direction for the Russians to gain a foothold several areas within the city. They're likely going to move through the Dacha area, forest areas, and Pivnishne, where the goal is to gain a foothold in the apartment complex area and move towards the central parts to start street fighting within the city. The city of Toretsk still remains fully under Ukrainian control. However, with the loss of the first and second lines of defense, as well as the 2014 line of defense to the south, combined with New York, the situation in Toretsk has degraded significantly in favor of the Russians, and this has created many problems for the Ukrainians, and this will manifest themselves in the Russian operations in the coming days and weeks. In the north, by Vyemka, the Russians have managed to advance a small bit further towards the few houses village, where the Ukrainians have possessions here to the south. The Russians previously captured Ivano-Darivka, but due to the Ukrainians still having control over the heights with fortified positions, control could not be held. Therefore, the Russians withdrew to avoid casualties until they launched operations through the heights to gain control over the fortified positions. They are now expanding the front line to the south by moving the direction of Vyemka along the railways going through from Nahirna and Belorivka to the south towards Vyemka, and they are now very close towards the village, but it will not significantly change the situation as there's still this river line here to the south of the fortified positions, and the Ukrainians still have the advantage of the high ground on the other bank of the river. Therefore, the Russians are in no position to simply just drive through towards Siversk, but instead this will be a further development in favor of improving the positions of the Russians ahead of an offensive coming from the east, where their height elevation is equal rather than the Ukrainians having an advantage. The objective would be for the Russians to move along the river line from the south and combine that with an assault from the east, which will negate the Ukrainian height advantage, and the Russians will pincer the Ukrainian forces from two directions, and this will force the Ukrainians to then withdraw from their positions towards Siversk itself, where fighting would then take place. The Ukrainians still have strong positions by Verkhnokamensk in the center and the positions in the north on the heights as well. This will lead to the Russians having a difficult time in the section of the front line until they launch a general offensive, similar to the following the control of Lysychansk in the summer of 2022. Moving on to the Kharkiv section of the front line, the Russians are slowly moving from Hlyboki towards Lipsy yet again, following the Ukrainian withdrawal and relocation of troops from the Kharkiv section towards the Kursk section of the front line. The Ukrainian defenses here have weakened and the pressure on the Russian forces have weakened, and this has led to the Russians regaining the initiative, regaining full control of Hlyboki, and starting offensive operations towards the Dacha area yet again. We're seeing that the Russians have restarted positional fighting in the Hlyboki-Lipsy section of the Kharkiv front line. In the Kursk section of the front line, we see that the Ukrainians have managed to advance in 3 separate directions and captured 3 separate villages. In the western parts, the Ukrainians now have control over the entire road from Borodivka here in the south all the way to Osnagost and Vishnivka to the north. The objective of the Ukrainians here is to launch a general offensive from not the border area, because the Russians are prepared there with fortified positions, but from the flank to gain control over the land bridge, avoiding the river line here to the north between Koronevo and the Russian positions in the south, where they will continue offensive operations along the side of the fortified positions of the Russians towards gaining full control. So they'll likely also expand here from Zetkino and from the western flank to attack both flanks at the same time and push the Russians up against the river line in the north. This is the initial stages of an expanded Kursk offensive. But this raises the question, after Kursk incursion, what will Ukraine do next? And that is exactly the one I've answered, but the same question was asked by The Times. In it, they talk about how Zelensky claimed that this operation is to create a border buffer area in the Russian zone, but at the same time, he also points it being towards negotiations. However, so far, there's no evidence towards this being used for negotiations. Instead, the Ukrainians have established a military commandant's office in the occupied region, which leads to them clearly pointing towards expanding the front and expanding the operation rather than slowing down and holding what they are already hands on. Now the question is raised, is this worth it? Can they just continue doing this at a sustainable rate? And that is a very difficult question to answer because we do not really know the details. But it is clear that with the current situation, if the Ukrainians decide to pull out, it will be very difficult for them because now the Russians have established a front line, which means that if the Ukrainians do attempt to withdraw, then the Russians will, in this case, heavily bombard their positions during their withdrawal. And this brings us to the second article by Forbes, David Axe. He talks about how the Ukrainians are too vulnerable in the Kursk region. They're out in the open and on the move, and this just is a recipe for getting hit by Lancet drones, artillery, FAB bombs, and so on. And this causes the Ukrainian forces to lose lots of armored vehicles. He does argue that this could still be worth it, losing all of these armored vehicles, if it leads to something positive, like the Ukrainians holding on to this portion of the Kursk region to hold on for negotiations. Which brings us to this third article by the New York Times. Ukraine says its incursion will bring peace. Putin's plans may differ. And pretty much what this article talks about is how the Russians are not pushing for negotiations anymore. On the contrary, they're pushing for revenge. They say that hopes for peaceful settlements between Russia and Ukraine have completely collapsed after the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region, and now instead Putin and all of his political allies, as well as his political enemies in the Russian parliament, now all agree that this war should be fought and it should be won, because something like this is beyond what the Russians accept. It is another one of Putin's red lines. And this brings us to the final topic of this video, which is exactly that, Putin's red lines. Someone has constantly been saying, whether it is pro-Russians, pro-Ukrainians, analysts, journalists, everyone keeps saying that Putin's red lines are practically just an illusion. He sets them up, he draws them on the floor, the Ukrainians pass through, the United States pass through, Europe passes through, and there's never any consequences. And I beg to differ. I say that this is completely untrue. Every single time the West, Ukraine, whoever crosses a red line of Russia, Russia responds in one way or another. An example is the different military industrial complexes of European nations spontaneously combusting. That is sabotage, likely by Russian spies and so on. At the same time, the Russians recently, on August 6th, just before the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, sent S-400 systems as well as electronic warfare systems to Iran, as Iran prepares for their strike back at Israel for retaliation. This is also a significant development, as S-400 systems and electronic warfare systems cannot be operated by Iran yet. They still need training for these systems. This means that the Russians have not just sent them systems, but also operators to operate them and instructors to teach the Iranians to use these systems. And this is a significant escalation, because it means that if Israel and the United States end up at war with Iran, then they would have to face off against the S-400 system compared to previously just the S-300 systems. So this makes it more difficult for the United States and Israel. They have to replan, restructure their development plans and so on. And in the end, it is exactly the same as the West sending air defense to Ukraine. So this is how Russia responds. They respond on a larger geopolitical scene and not just in the context of the war in Ukraine. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out our Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.